Hi there, and welcome back to the Ingrain Workshop. I'm Rick. I'd like to take a moment and thank all the new subscribers to the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. And if you're new to the channel and you like DIY projects or shop renovation projects, then hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. So in today's video, we're going to be installing the faux beams that we built last week. So let's get started. Let's start installing some faux beams. The first thing we got to do is a little wall prep. As you can see here around the window, I've got a 1x6 that trims out the window, and I've also got a 1x4 that covers up the T111 joint. So what I'm going to have to do is take a Dremel tool and cut into this trim and cut it back enough so the beam, the faux beam, will slide in here. Now, before we make the first cut on the first beam, this is going to be our diagonal beam. This is the diagonal metal brace on the metal building, and the angle here at the bottom is 150 degrees. So the angle from the bottom of the diagonal to the wall is 150 degrees. So what we're going to have to do is subtract 90 degrees from that, because our board is already cut at a 90-degree angle. And then when you subtract 90 degrees from 150, you get 60 degrees, and that's the angle that we need to make the cut. At the top, our angle is 134 degrees. So again, our board is cut at 90 degrees. So 90 minus 134 gives us 44 degrees. So our top angle is going to be 44 degrees. Our bottom angle is going to be 60 degrees. We're going to take our 5-foot beam over to the chop saw, and then we're going to cut the top and bottom at those angles. I cut just a scrap piece or a mock-up. This is just a piece off of one of the beams. I've got two angles on here. The two angles that we're using, the angle at the top and then the angle at the bottom. The angle at the bottom, like I said, this angle is 150 degrees, less 90 degrees is 60 degrees. This angle here is cut at 60 degrees, so we can slide it over, give us an idea of how the bottom's going to join the wall, and then you can also slide it up. I believe the top angle is at 44 degrees, and then we can slide it up and see the angle at the top. Just to make sure all our angles and cuts are going to be correct. So the first thing I'm going to do is use this mock-up to mark some lines on the trim so I'll know where to cut with the Dremel, and then we'll cut out this excess trim wood, and then we'll install the diagonal faux beam. So here's a closer look at what I just did. You can see that there's roughly 3/4 of an inch cut out on both sides of the diagonal metal brace, and that will give the faux beam enough room to slide up into that trim. And then I did have to trim just a small, maybe 1/8 of an inch off of this 6-inch piece of trim. And then on the corner, you can see where I had to just chisel it out at the angle, the 60-degree angle, so the faux beam would fit right in there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and stain the inside of all these edges. That way it won't be as visible when I install the faux beam. So here I'm making the first angled cut at 60 degrees. I had to take the dust hood off of the chop saw, so I was able to get to that angle. So I went ahead and took the dust cover off the chop saw, or the miter saw station. And then once I got the angle cut at 60 degrees, I just used some 180 grit sandpaper just to knock down the burrs from the cut. You know, you want to get as tight and flush as a fit that you can. And then after I took and knocked down all the burrs, I set the angle from 60 degrees over to 44 degrees to make the cut at the top of the diagonal beam. And you'll see here I'm pulling out a stick, and basically it's a 1x2 that I have the bottom angle cut and the top angle cut already cut on that 1x2, along with the actual size or dimension for the diagonal beam. So I'm just using that as a cheat stick or a story stick, whatever you want to call it, just to make sure that I'm cutting the angles at the right locations and cutting them in the right direction. So again, it's just a reference stick because I don't have any extra beams, so I can't really afford to mess up on any of these cuts. But it's always a good idea to have a story stick or a cheat stick just so you can make sure that all your cuts are going to be correct. And again, on this end, I'm just taking, again, the 180 grit sandpaper and just sanding off all the burrs. And once I get all the burrs sanded off, I'm going to run over and get some stain. You don't want the exposed ends. You want to take and put some stain on them. That way, you want the joint to be as flush as possible, but whatever gap there might be, if it's stained, if your cut is stained, it's going to be a lot less visible than if it's just the finished wood there, because that white wood's going to be very visible in the joint. So just make sure you go ahead and stain it. And again, it's a lot easier to stain it here at the miter station versus trying to stain it once you get it installed. And then I'm just taking the air hose and just blowing off all the sawdust that's on the beam and just cleaning it up and getting ready to get it installed on the diagonal brace. Now it's time to install the brace or the beam. It's a snug fit, so once I put it up here and get it around the brace, it will pretty much stay in place. And then I can just take a rubber mallet and then make any fine adjustments that I need to, just to make sure that it's a nice, snug, flush fit. And it turned out real good. The joints were pretty tight. I think on the window trim side, I did have to go back and get some stain and stain the joint, because the white wood on the actual window trim was showing, because I was very careful not to get any of the stain on the T111 siding. So that's why I chose to stain this after the beam was already in place. So once I stained the window trim, it came out great. Okay, so this is the first diagonal brace that we installed. And you can see it's up there by itself with no fasteners. You can see the joint where we cut the trim so the piece could fit in. So it turned out really well. I did have to go back and stain because there was a bare piece of wood showing. But that's pretty much it for the diagonal beam. It's in place. I'm going to take 3 self-tapping screws and just screw them into the metal. I'm just going to use, I think, 1 3/4" self-tapping metal screws and the impact driver, and put in, I believe, 3, just 1 on each end and then 1 in the middle, and just on the back side of the beam. And that's sufficient. You don't need a lot to hold these beams. They're very lightweight, and that's why they're faux beams or just decorative beams. Okay, so we just installed the what I call the diagonal beam. The next faux beam that we're going to install is what I call the vaulted beam, because this beam is going to be nailed to a nailer that's nailed to the vaulted portion of the roof. We already know what this angle is. This is 134 degrees, and we had to make our cut at 44 degrees. 134 less 90 degrees gives us 44 degrees. Now we need to figure out what the angle is at the top where the vaulted portion meets the flat portion of the roof. So let me get on the ladder, move the ladder, get over there, and we'll get that angle. So we'll have the angle for both ends. We already know that this angle is going to be 44 degrees. We just need to figure out what that angle needs to be. Okay, so over here on the angle where the flat ceiling meets the vaulted ceiling, we have 163 degrees. So here, we're going to take 180 degrees, subtract out the 163, and that's going to leave us with 17 degrees. So on this end of the vaulted beam, we're going to need to cut it at 17 degrees. So the end that's going to adjoin with the diagonal beam is going to be 44 degrees, and the end of the beam that's going to be adjoining the flat beam, it needs to be 17 degrees. So let's grab a 5-foot beam and cut it down to length at those two angles and get that installed. So just like with the diagonal beam, for the vaulted beam, I'm able to leave the chop saw at 44 degrees because I know that that's going to be the same angle cut for this end of the vaulted beam. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave the chop saw where it is and make that cut. And now I'm going to take and adjust the angle to the 17 degree angle that we need on the other end of the beam, and then I'll make that cut. And then I pretty much will do the same thing as I did for the diagonal beam. Once all the cuts are made, I will go back and just clean them up with some sandpaper just to knock down all the burrs, and then I'll take and grab some stain and stain the ends so they're not white any longer, and that will conceal whatever issue I might have with a gap at a joint. But because these angles are measured right and the dimensions of the beams are correct, there were very little gaps. No need to go back and put in any wood putty, wood filler, any caulk or anything. I think just staining the ends was sufficient enough to conceal the joint, and all the joints looked good. So, once I get the stain on both ends, I'm just going to take the air hose and just blow off all the sawdust, clean them up before I install it. One thing I really miss is not having the dust collection system hooked up during this renovation. It just makes controlling the dust a nightmare. So I'm constantly having to blow off the miter saw and the miter station just to keep things somewhat clean. Here I'm going to take I believe it's a 2x3 along with some metal self-tapping screws. I think these screws might have been 2.5 inches long, maybe 2 3/4 inches, and I'm just taking and screwing the nailer into the actual truss. And then I'm using the mock-up just to line it up so I know that the nailer is in line with the diagonal truss. That way when I do go to put the faux beam up in the vaulted portion, I know it's going to line up exactly with the diagonal brace. And once I get the nailer screwed and in place, then I can go back and install the faux beam here at the vaulted portion of the ceiling. You'll notice too that I'm using the same mock-up that I used for the diagonal brace. There was no sense in creating a new mock-up since the diagonal brace mock-up had an angle at 44 degrees, which was the same angle that I needed to cut that end of the vaulted beam. So I just went ahead and used the same mock-up that I had used on the diagonal beam. And if I'm being honest here, the toughest part of this whole project was probably screwing in these 2x3 nailers, because you're upside down, you're trying to screw in a 2 3/4 inch screw into a metal stud. It definitely was a workout on the shoulders. So here now I'm going in and just dry fitting the vaulted beam just to make sure that I've got the fit that I'm looking for. And once I've got it, then I just take the brad nailer and tack it in and get it in place. And it turned out good. You can see that the joints are real tight, and it's coming together looking like a rustic building or a rustic barn. Unlike the diagonal beam, because we're nailing the vaulted beam in place, I am nailing it from both sides. You don't even have to go back and fill the nail holes with putty.
they're just not visible. They're too small, plus the dark stain of the beam. You just really can't see any of the nail holes whatsoever. So I am shooting nails on both sides of the beam. And then I'll zoom in here and let you get a closer look at the joint just to see how the two beams come together. And you can see, I mean, it's a nice fit, and they look really nice. I'm very pleased with just the look of the beam, and then, you know, how they fit together. I think it came out really well. Okay, so now we've got the diagonal brace beam in, we've got the vaulted ceiling beam in. So the next two 8-foot beams are going to be here in the flat roof section. So I'm going to have the foreman, my son Crazy Kiefer, give me an assist here, and we're going to get these two up for you. And then that'll get us to the other side of the workshop, where we'll just have to do just the opposite. We'll have to install the diagonal brace, and then the diagonal beam, and then the beam for the vaulted ceiling. Okay, so you're probably wondering, how did that 8-foot beam get up there? Well, that was my fault. I didn't have the camera on when the foreman came in, so we went ahead and installed it. And when I climbed down, I noticed that the camera wasn't on. So when we installed the second 8-foot beam, definitely made sure the camera was running. And you can see the both of us here. He's just holding it up for me until I can get some self-tapping screws in. And then once I get a couple of screws into the beam, you know, I send him on his way back to playing Fortnite or whatever he does in his room. But no, he's a big help. Thanks to the foreman, we now have both of the beams installed at the flat ceiling, and I'll show you the beam that we've done so far, the total beam, which includes the two flat beams, the one vaulted beam, and then the one diagonal beam. Let me show you that. So here's the two flat beams, and then there's the vaulted beam, and then the diagonal beam. So we're on the other side of the workshop now. So all we have left to do is to install the vaulted beam on this side and the diagonal beam. So what I've been doing is, it's easier because of the joint to install the diagonal beam first and then install the vaulted beam last, because then it just slides in. This, the way the joint is for the diagonal beam, it makes it hard to put the diagonal beam in if you've already got the vaulted beam in. So we're going to do the vaulted beam last. So right now I'm going to take, just like I did on the other side of the workshop, I'm going to have to take the Dremel and cut the trim there to fit for the beam. So again, I'm just going to take the mock-up that I've made and just use that as a template and go ahead and put it in place. And once I have everything lined up, I'll just take my pencil and mark me a couple of lines on the trim piece, and that'll kind of give me a guide of where I need to cut with the Dremel. But before I cut with the Dremel, the height at which I cut the trim is, I think, 1 3/4 inches. So what I do is I measure up 1 3/4 inches, and then I take my hammer and chisel and just make an indentation into the trim, so I know how far up to cut with the Dremel, because all I'm using the Dremel for is to cut the vertical cut. As far as the horizontal cut goes, I'll just use the hammer and the chisel to knock out the horizontal portion, but I wait and do that once I get the vertical sides cut with the Dremel. And the only thing you want to make sure you do here is cut all the way through the trim. You don't need to cut all the way through the T111 siding, but you can tell when you're cutting with the Dremel when it bottoms out up against the T111 siding. So then you know that you've cut through the entire 1x trim. And like I said, you just cut the vertical piece all the way up to where you've made the horizontal score with your chisel, and then do the same thing on the other side. And once both vertical sides are cut completely through, then I can take the hammer and the chisel and finish the horizontal cut, and then the trim just comes out, and then I'm ready to stain the exposed edges and install the diagonal beam. Before I go back and stain, I'm going to take the mock-up and just hold it up there and make sure that my cut's right and that the mock-up is fitting in there nice and tight. And as you can see, it's a real nice, snug, tight fit. And once I do that, then I can go back and stain all the exposed edges and get ready to install the diagonal brace. Here I'm just putting the diagonal brace in place and just taking my rubber mallet and just tapping it in to get to the actual finished location. And then I'm just going to take and screw in some 1 3/4 inch self-tapping screws with the impact driver. And just like I did on the other side of the workshop, I'm going to put one at the bottom, one at the top, and then just one at the middle. And again, I'm only doing it on the back side of the beam. That way it'll be less visible. But again, due to the light weight of these faux beams, 3 fasteners is enough to hold it in place. It can pretty much hold itself up in place, but 3 fasteners is about all I needed here.
Now all that's left is the vaulted beam, which I've got right here. And as you remember from the vaulted beam on the other side, we cut the top at 44 degrees and we cut the bottom at 17 degrees. So again, it's the same angles and dimensions as the vaulted beam on the other side of the workshop. Everything's identical on the opposite side. So this is the last beam that we need to install, and this one beam will be 100% complete. Okay, so that completes the installation of the faux beam. So that's how you install a rustic faux beam in a workshop. Now I need to just do that 6 more times because I got a total of 7 trusses that I have to cover up. So once I get the next 6 beams installed, then I'll show you the completed project. Thanks.
Okay, so the project's finally complete, and you can see the difference that the faux beams make to the ceiling. I mean, it really gives it a nice rustic feel to the inside of the workshop. And now that I have the north, east, and west walls done, it's really even hard to tell that this is a metal building when you're inside. It just looks like you're in a rustic barn or a rustic cabin. I still have to finish up the west wall and the overhead door, but as far as the beams go and the trim on the other walls, everything is complete. And it's really looking nice. I do have to get rid of all the temporary lighting that's in the ceiling right now and go ahead and wire up everything, trim out the electrical in the ceiling, and get the finished lighting installed. And it's turned out nice.
Well, that's going to wrap up this video on installing rustic faux beams in the workshop. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it helps you out in your project. Now get out there and create, build, and inspire, and as always, pay it forward. This is Rick at the Ingrain Workshop, signing out. I'll see you guys next week. Thank you.